The Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions, unearthed from a remote site in the Sinai desert, explicitly mention Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, revealing that for many ancient Israelites, their god Yahweh was not necessarily worshipped alone. This ancient pottery, scrawled with blessings from both Yahweh and a goddess known from Canaanite texts, directly confronts the popular image of Israel as a purely monotheistic people from its very inception, hinting at a much more complex and often contradictory religious landscape than we might expect. The discovery forces us to ask, what did worshiping Yahweh truly mean for those who lived thousands of years ago? And how did their understanding of the divine assembly differ from our own, shaped by centuries of later theology? What was the story you grew up with about ancient Israel's God? Was it always a singular, exclusive worship, or were you taught a more nuanced history? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. For many, the idea of ancient Israelite religion is simple: one God, Yahweh, and a steadfast rejection of all others. This image is deeply ingrained, drawn from powerful biblical narratives like the giving of the Ten Commandments, which begins with the unequivocal declaration, "You shall have no other gods before me." It's a vision of religious purity, a stark contrast against the polytheistic world of Canaan. Yet archaeology often whispers a different story, one of shared shrines, mingled deities, and a spiritual life far richer in its pantheon than often imagined. The Bible itself, when read closely, isn't always so straightforward. It tells of prophets railing against foreign gods, kings tearing down altars, and a people constantly warned against apostasy, a struggle that implies these other gods were not just conceptual threats, but very real, very present objects of devotion for many within Israel. Consider the language itself. The Hebrew word Elohim, which we often translate as God, can also mean gods. When Genesis begins, "In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth," it uses a plural noun with a singular verb. A linguistic curiosity, perhaps, or a subtle echo of a time when the concept of divinity was more expansive. In Psalm 82, it says, "God stands in the divine assembly. Among the gods he pronounces judgment." The text doesn't deny the existence of other Elohim. It places Yahweh as supreme among them, presiding over a cosmic court. This is a crucial distinction between what scholars call monolatry, the worship of one God while acknowledging the existence of others, and monotheism, the belief that only one God exists. Early Israel, it seems, was often practicing the former, even as its most fervent prophets pushed for the latter. This concept of a divine assembly is not unique to ancient Israel. It resonates strongly with the myths and epics of their Canaanite neighbors. From the ancient city of Ugarit, archaeologists have unearthed clay tablets that speak of El, the head of the Canaanite pantheon, who presides over an assembly of gods and goddesses. In these texts, El is portrayed as a wise, ancient deity, a father figure to other gods like Baal, the storm god, and Asherah, the mother goddess. When Psalm 82 places Yahweh at the head of a divine assembly, judging other Elohim, some scholars argue this shows an ancient Israelite tradition where Yahweh, originally perhaps a junior deity or a powerful warrior god, gradually assimilated the attributes and position of El, effectively taking over the leadership of the pantheon. This wasn't necessarily a radical break from Canaanite cosmology, but rather a reinterpretation, placing Yahweh firmly at the apex. The process by which Yahweh rose to supreme prominence is a fascinating journey through shifting political landscapes and theological developments.
Early biblical poems, such as the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 or the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, present Yahweh as a formidable warrior deity, a god of battles who leads his people to victory. These are not descriptions of a universal, abstract creator god, but of a fierce, protective, and localized deity whose power is demonstrated through his actions on behalf of Israel. What's striking is the lack of archaeological evidence for significant temple complexes dedicated to other major deities within Israelite territory, comparable to the grand temples of Yahweh, particularly in Jerusalem. While other gods were clearly acknowledged and sometimes worshipped, it seems Yahweh's cult eventually enjoyed state sponsorship and centralized importance, especially in Judah. This institutional backing surely played a role in his ascendancy. The figure of Asherah, mentioned in those Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions, is perhaps the most intriguing and persistent challenge to the narrative of exclusive Yahwehism. The Bible frequently condemns Asherah, plural, often translated as Asherah poles or cultic trees, which are associated with idolatry and foreign worship. But what was Asherah really? Was she merely a wooden cult object or a powerful goddess in her own right, seen by some as Yahweh's consort? The inscriptions from Kuntillet Ajrud and another site, Hirbet el-Kam, both connect Asherah directly with Yahweh, invoking blessings from Yahweh and his Asherah. While some scholars interpret his Asherah as a reference to a cult object belonging to Yahweh, the direct grammatical connection strongly suggests a divine partner for many who etched these words. Furthermore, archaeologists have found countless small female figurines throughout Israelite domestic contexts, often interpreted as representations of Asherah or similar fertility goddesses, suggesting a widespread popular veneration. This leads us to the distinction between official state religion and the vibrant, often unruly world of household religion and folk practice. While biblical texts, particularly those from the Deuteronomic school, emphasize centralized worship at the temple in Jerusalem and adherence to strict Yahwistic monolatry, the archaeological record tells us that everyday people often worshipped in much more diverse ways. Excavations of Israelite homes revealed domestic altars, small cult stands, and a proliferation of those female figurines. These objects were not hidden away. They were part of daily life, likely used in personal rituals related to fertility, protection, and prosperity. The prophets constantly railing against high places and sacred poles throughout the land suggest that even if the Jerusalem temple focused on Yahweh, many local shrines and private homes honored other deities, or at least invoked divine powers that went beyond the singular figure of Yahweh as understood by the priestly elite. Beyond Asherah, the Bible itself testifies to the allure and persistent presence of other gods in the Israelite imagination, and, crucially, their practices. Baal, the storm god of Canaan, is frequently mentioned, often in direct opposition to Yahweh, such as in the dramatic showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Molech, a deity associated with child sacrifice, and the Queen of Heaven, often identified with the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar or the Canaanite Astarte, also appear as objects of Israelite worship, particularly during periods of perceived apostasy. These references are not just theological strawmen. They describe actual practices that biblical authors felt compelled to denounce. The very vehemence of the prophetic condemnations is compelling evidence that these deities were not just abstract threats, but real competitors for the loyalty and devotion of many Israelites. The political and religious reforms of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, dramatically narrated in the books of Kings, represent significant attempts to purify Israelite worship and centralize it around Yahweh alone. Hezekiah, in the late 8th century BCE, is described as smashing the bronze serpent Nehushtan, destroying high places, and cutting down Asherah poles. About a century later, Josiah's reforms were even more radical, sparked by the discovery of a book of the law in the temple. He expanded the purge, tearing down shrines throughout Judah, defiling altars, and bringing all worship to the Jerusalem temple. Archaeologically, there is some evidence to support these narratives. Certain sites show destruction layers consistent with the dismantling of local shrines and a marked increase in cultic activity in Jerusalem during these periods. Yet the question remains, how effective were these reforms? Did they genuinely eradicate polytheistic practices, or did they merely drive them underground, fostering a resilient folk religion that continued to honor a broader spectrum of deities in private? Perhaps the most significant theological shift towards an absolute, exclusive monotheism occurred during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. The trauma of national defeat, the destruction of the temple, and the forced relocation to a foreign land prompted a profound theological reevaluation. Why had this happened? For many, the answer lay in Israel's unfaithfulness to Yahweh, their constant straying after other gods. It was during this period that the Deuteronomonic theology, with its emphasis on exclusive covenant loyalty to Yahweh, solidified. The prophet known as 2nd Isaiah, writing from exile, declares with unprecedented clarity, "I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God." This is not just monolatry, it is a full-fledged declaration of absolute monotheism, asserting not just that Israel should worship only Yahweh, but that Yahweh is the only God who exists. The exile, therefore, appears to have been a crucible in which the diverse, often syncretistic beliefs of earlier Israel were refined into the firm monotheism that would characterize post-exilic Judaism. One of the greatest challenges in understanding ancient Israelite religion is acknowledging its historical development. It wasn't a static, fully formed belief system that sprang into existence with Abraham or Moses and remained unchanged for millennia. Like any living religion, it evolved. Early Israelite religion, especially during the Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 586 BCE, was part of the broader ancient Near Eastern religious landscape. It shared cosmological elements, myths, and even deities with its neighbors. The Bible itself, when read as a collection of texts written over centuries, reflects this journey. We see older traditions, adapted and reinterpreted, sitting alongside later, more developed theological insights. The ideal Israelite religion presented by certain biblical authors, particularly those associated with the Deuteronomic school and the priestly traditions, often reflects a desired state of affairs rather than the messy, lived reality of the Israelite populace throughout its long history. Even within a developing monotheistic framework, a shadow pantheon of divine beings continued to populate the Israelite spiritual world. We read of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, who appear in Genesis 6 and Job, sometimes interpreted as divine beings or lesser deities. Angels, divine messengers, and even Satan, the adversary, develop as figures within Israelite theology. While these beings are clearly subordinate to Yahweh, their existence reflects a cosmic order that isn't entirely empty save for one singular God. Comparisons with other ancient Near Eastern mythologies reveal similar divine entourages around supreme deities.
The debate then becomes whether these figures represent lingering remnants of a polytheistic past, gradually demoted and integrated into a monotheistic worldview as mere servants of the one God, or if they are simply part of a complex hierarchy that even a strict monotheism can accommodate. The religious differences between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah after the split provide another layer of complexity. The Bible, largely written from a Judahite perspective, often casts the northern kingdom in a negative light, particularly concerning its religious practices. King Jeroboam I, founder of the northern kingdom, is condemned for setting up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, described as a grave sin that led Israel astray. Yet, these calves might not have been worshipped as separate deities. They could have been pedestals for the invisible Yahweh, a common Near Eastern iconographic motif for divine presence. It's possible that the northern kingdom maintained older Israelite traditions, perhaps closer to a syncretistic Canaanite influence, which were later denounced as idolatrous by the more rigorously Yahwistic Judahite scribes. Archaeological findings in the north, such as bull figurines, tend to support a more diverse cultic landscape than in Judah. Throughout the biblical narrative, the prophetic voice stands as a persistent, sometimes furious advocate for exclusive Yahwism. Prophets like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah constantly rail against the worship of other gods, the burning of incense to foreign deities, and participation in cults like Baal or Asherah. Their condemnations are so frequent and intense that they paint a vivid picture of a continuous struggle. It wasn't a one-time apostasy. It was a recurrent, deeply embedded aspect of Israelite religious life that the prophets were desperately trying to uproot. The very existence of these condemnations is, paradoxically, some of the strongest evidence that these practices were widespread. If no one was worshiping other gods, why would the prophets spend so much energy condemning it? Their sermons weren't hypothetical. They were directed at a very real and present religious pluralism among their own people. We need to consider the nuances of the word God itself. The Hebrew Elohim, as mentioned, has a broader semantic range than our English God. It can refer to divine beings, judges, angels, or even powerful human figures. In early Semitic thought, El, singular of Elohim, simply meant power or deity. So, when ancient Israelites spoke of Elohim, they might not always have been referring to separate, independent divine entities in the way we conceive of polytheistic pantheons. It's possible that many of these gods were understood as different manifestations, aspects, or subordinate powers within a broader cosmic framework that was ultimately presided over by Yahweh. Linguistic analysis helps us understand how a word can evolve in meaning and how different understandings of divinity could exist simultaneously even within a developing monotheistic tradition. Essa análise nos força a olhar além da palavra para a realidade palpável que as evidências arqueológicas nos apresentam. E é aí que as coisas se tornam ainda mais fascinantes e talvez desconfortáveis para algumas narrativas. Pense nas inscrições de Kuntillet Ajrud, um sítio remoto no deserto do Sinai que data do século 8 a.C. Ali, peregrinos ou comerciantes gravaram mensagens que incluem a frase Yahweh de Samaria e sua Asherah, ou Yahweh de Temã e sua Asherah. Não estamos falando de um herege isolado, mas de um testemunho direto da fé popular da época. Quem era essa Asherah, então, para ser associada tão intimamente com Yahweh, quase como uma consorte divina?
A própria Bíblia condena os postes de Asherah e as imagens dela, mas a descoberta em Kuntillet Ajrud e a profusão de figuras femininas de pilares em sítios israelitas, aquelas estatuetas com seios proeminentes encontradas em lares, não em templos oficiais, indicam que a devoção a essa deusa da fertilidade estava profundamente enraizada na vida cotidiana. Era essa Asherah um deus separado no sentido moderno, ou talvez, como o termo Elohim sugere, uma manifestação de poder divino que coexistia na mente do israelita comum com Yahweh, o deus patrono? A linha é turva. As condenações proféticas, outrora vistas como prova de um monoteísmo puro combatendo desvios, hoje são cada vez mais interpretadas como a prova de que o monoteísmo como conhecemos era, na verdade, uma aspiração. Uma luta ideológica travada por uma elite sacerdotal e profética contra uma prática popular que, para o povo, não parecia contraditória. Imagine o que isso significava para a família que tinha sua pequena estatueta de Asherah em casa, talvez para garantir a fertilidade das mulheres ou das colheitas. Eles se consideravam devotos de Yahweh? Provavelmente sim. Mas a religião era pragmática e eles queriam todas as bênçãos possíveis, de todas as fontes divinas que conheciam. A Bíblia, por sua vez, muitas vezes pinta Yahweh não como o único ser divino, mas como Deus supremo sobre uma corte celestial. Pense no conselho divino mencionado em Salmos 82 ou no livro de Jó, onde os filhos de Deus se reúnem. Yahweh preside, mas não está sozinho no cosmos. Isso não é polidemonismo, nem politeísmo no sentido grego de deuses com panteões iguais. É algo mais complexo, uma espécie de enoteísmo ou monolatria, onde se reconhece a existência de outros poderes divinos, mas se adora e se dedica apenas a um.
Entender essa distinção é crucial para desvendar a verdadeira paisagem religiosa daquele tempo. Revela que o próprio Yahweh era, para muitos, o chefe de uma corte celestial, não uma divindade solitária pairando no vazio. Essa corte celestial, muitas vezes referida como a Assembleia Divina, não era apenas uma metáfora poética para os antigos israelitas, era uma realidade cosmológica. Pense em Deuteronômio 32, versículos 8 e 9. A versão que temos hoje, o texto massorético, diz que o Altíssimo dividiu as nações segundo o número dos filhos de Israel. Mas as cópias mais antigas, encontradas nos manuscritos do Mar Morto e na Septuaginta grega, contam uma história diferente. Ali se lê que Deus dividiu as nações segundo o número dos filhos de Deus, ou filhos de El. Esta pequena variação textual muda tudo. Sugere que Yahweh, o Deus de Israel, recebeu Israel como sua porção e herança em uma espécie de sorteio cósmico, enquanto as outras nações foram designadas a outros poderes divinos. Para mim, esta é uma das revelações mais impactantes da arqueologia textual. Não se trata de uma negação da existência desses outros filhos de Deus, mas sim de uma demarcação clara de território divino. Yahweh é o Deus de Israel, e Israel só deve adorar a Yahweh. Isso não implica que os deuses das outras nações não existam, apenas que não são o seu Deus. É o que chamamos de monolatria, um reconhecimento da existência de múltiplos deuses, mas a adoração exclusiva a um. A luta profética, então, ganha uma nova camada de profundidade. Não era apenas contra a idolatria, mas sim contra o reconhecimento, mesmo que implícito, de que esses outros filhos de El tinham alguma legitimidade em seu próprio domínio. Imaginem a complexidade para o povo comum. Eles viviam em um mundo saturado de divindades, onde cada rio, montanha ou cidade podia ter seu patrono. Mesmo que os sacerdotes e profetas de Jerusalém insistissem na exclusividade de Yahweh, a ideia de buscar proteção e bênçãos de outras fontes, especialmente para coisas tão terrenas como a fertilidade da terra ou a saúde dos filhos, era quase intuitiva.
As descobertas arqueológicas, como os ostracas de Kuntillet Ajrud com a inscrição Yahweh de Temã e sua Asherah, nos mostram isso de forma palpável. Não era uma adoração pagã radical, mas uma sincretização que, na mente do povo, complementava a lealdade a Yahweh. Onde o cânon bíblico mais tarde consolidou a ideia de que esses outros deuses eram nada, meros ídolos de madeira e pedra, a história nos sugere uma trajetória mais sinuosa. No início, parecia haver uma aceitação mais implícita de que sim, havia uma Assembleia Divina, e Yahweh era o supremo entre eles, ou o patrono designado para Israel. A grande virada para o monoteísmo estrito, a ideia de que Yahweh é o único e não há outros deuses reais além dele, foi uma construção gradual, uma vitória ideológica que demorou séculos para se firmar plenamente. E é crucial entender esta transição, porque ela reflete não apenas uma mudança teológica, mas uma redefinição profunda da identidade israelita. Como você redefine a relação de um povo com o divino quando o chefe da sua corte celestial se torna o único governante do universo? Essa era a questão. A tensão entre o que as pessoas praticavam, o que os escribas registravam e o que os profetas exigiam moldou uma fé que, até hoje, carrega as cicatrizes e as glórias dessa complexidade. The journey of ancient Israelite religion, from a probable monolatry acknowledging other divine beings to the eventual triumph of an absolute monotheism, is a profound testament to the dynamic nature of faith and belief. It's a story not of static adherence, but of theological struggle, political maneuvering, and cultural assimilation. This understanding doesn't diminish the power or uniqueness of Israel's monotheistic legacy. Instead, it enriches it. It reveals a faith that was forged in the crucible of real historical experience, constantly challenged by its environment and continually refined by its prophets and theologians. To see this complex process is to appreciate the true depth of the biblical narrative. A human story of striving towards an ideal, a vision of one God, Yahweh, who ultimately demands and receives exclusive worship. What then can we say with confidence about ancient Israel's gods?
We can confidently state that while the foundational texts and eventual theology of Israel centered on Yahweh, the archaeological record and internal biblical evidence reveal a much more complex and often syncretistic reality on the ground. For centuries, many Israelites worshipped Yahweh alongside other deities like Asherah, or engaged in practices dedicated to figures like Baal, despite the fervent condemnations of prophets and reforming kings. The shift from monolatry, worshiping one god among others, to a strict monotheism, believing only one God exists, was a long, arduous process, largely solidified durante e após o cativeiro babilônico. We cannot definitively say that every Israelite was a staunch monotheist from day one. What we can say is que o último triunfo do exclusivo Yahvéismo, uma árdua vitória teológica, criou uma das mais enduráveis legados em change history, born não de uma pristina beginning, mas de uma persistente, às vezes messy, espiritual evolução. The journey of ancient Israelite religion, from a probable monolatry acknowledging other divine beings to the eventual triumph of an absolute monotheism, is a profound testament to the dynamic nature of faith and belief. It's a story not of static adherence, but of theological struggle, political maneuvering, and cultural assimilation. This understanding doesn't diminish the power or uniqueness of Israel's monotheistic legacy. Instead, it enriches it. It reveals a faith that was forged in the crucible of real historical experience, constantly challenged by its environment and continually refined by its prophets and theologians. To see this complex process is to appreciate the true depth of the biblical narrative. A human story of striving towards an ideal, a vision of one God, Yahweh, who ultimately demands and receives exclusive worship. What then can we say with confidence about ancient Israel's gods? We can confidently state that while the foundational texts and eventual theology of Israel centered on Yahweh, the archaeological record and internal biblical evidence reveal a much more complex and often syncretistic reality on the ground. For centuries, many Israelites worshipped Yahweh alongside other deities like Asherah, or engaged in practices dedicated to figures like Baal, despite the fervent condemnations of prophets and reforming kings. The shift from monolatry, worshipping one God among others, to a strict monotheism, believing only one God exists, was a long, arduous process, largely solidified durante e após o cativeiro babilônico. We cannot definitively say that every Israelite was a staunch monotheist from day one. What we can say is that the último triunfo de exclusivo Yahvéismo, uma árdua vitória teológica, criou uma das mais enduráveis legados em humana história, born não de uma pristina beginning, mas de uma persistente, às vezes messy, espiritual evolução. The story is not just of what was believed, but of how those beliefs were fought for, defended, and ultimately shaped over millennia.